think you just watch it every night and just relax.
Well, that's it from Erinsborough for today. I'm going to do the Aussie thing and chill out with a stubby. Lou?
What do I think of Linda? She's everything you'd want from a best mate.
What do you think? Whitney dressed as Britney?
Always thinking of other people.
Got my knickers on.
Always up for something new.
I love the way you all assume that all I want is a man.
So what do you want? A woman?
Well, why not?
Always ready with a smile.
Yeah, all right.
Lisa Tarbuck is Linda Green. Brand new drama starts Tuesday at 9 on BBC One.
Drop dead gorgeous.
That's our Linda.
And the new Radio Times contains features and previews on forthcoming BBC programmes, together with complete listings for all major television channels. You can see Doctors later this afternoon on BBC One at the new regular time of 2:10. But now, a BBC News special.
This is a special news programme being broadcast on BBC One and BBC News 24 in the UK and BBC World around the globe. I'm Jane Hill in Washington.
And I'm Lise Doucette in the Pakistani capital, Islamabad. The headlines. Britain puts 200 Royal Marines on standby for a ground mission in Afghanistan. More details are expected in a Ministry of Defence briefing in London. The Taliban capture a leading opposition commander during the latest fighting in Afghanistan. And the US anthrax alert continues. The FBI will get new powers to fight the terrorists.
The British government is giving details of the forces that will be deployed to Afghanistan. 200 Royal Marine Commandos will take part in special operations on the ground. A further 4,000 will remain on standby. The Armed Forces Minister, Adam Ingram, told the House of Commons that the decision showed the government's resolve to see through the war on terrorism. In other main developments, American warplanes have continued to bombard the Taliban front lines north of Kabul for the 6th consecutive day. The Taliban has captured one of the most prominent opposition commanders, Abdul Haq. He was seized after Taliban forces had spent 2 days surrounding the area where he was hiding. And President Bush, in a new bill, is to make it easier for investigators to tap phones and intercept the emails of suspected terrorists. Suspects will also be able to be imprisoned for longer on minor charges.
These troops, having spent the last month on exercise in Oman, were informed this morning of their fate. Most of them will soon be back in the United Kingdom, but 200 commandos will remain in the region and be made available for assaults on Afghanistan.
With the end of the exercise in sight, the time has come to decide what force deployments offer the right balance of capabilities to enable us to continue to play a full part in the coalition's military operations. We have rightly made a commitment to our closest ally, the United States, to stand shoulder to shoulder with them, and we are determined to do just that.
The force will be based on Royal Navy ships already in the area. The total deployment includes submarines, destroyers and an aircraft carrier.
This powerful force totals some 4,200 personnel in theatre. It represents a major enhancement of the coalition's capabilities.
The Conservatives have offered their full support for the government and the armed forces involved.
We have faith in them, we admire them and are proud of them, and they deserve nothing less than the unreserved support of the House.
Operation Swift Sword, as the exercise in Oman was known, has been deemed a success, but it has raised some concerns about equipment. The Liberal Democrats sought reassurances on that front in the Commons this morning. They're also worried about cluster bombs.
Given that these bombs can cause not only a danger to civilians, but also to our own forces who then may occupy areas where they've been used, can the Minister give us an assurance today that we will not deploy cluster bombs? And can he assess as to whether it would be possible for the Americans to use an alternative weapon instead of using cluster bombs?
The Minister said he understood the sensitivity, but insisted cluster bombs are sometimes necessary. Tony Blair wasn't in the House of Commons this morning, but the Prime Minister has recorded this message of support for the troops. It'll be broadcast later today. Gita Hari, BBC News, Westminster.
Let's cross live now to the Ministry of Defence in London, where a briefing has just got underway on the British troop deployments. Let's hear Adam Ingram.
Good afternoon. As you know, I have just made a statement to the House. And as you will be aware, the Secretary of State for Defence is in Oman. Earlier this morning, he spoke to the officers and men of HQ 3 Commando Brigade Royal Marines serving in Oman as part of exercise Safe Syria 2. There has been a great deal of speculation in recent weeks, which we consider most of it to be ill-judged and unhelpful, about diverting our forces taking part in exercise Safe Syria 2 to conduct operations in and around Afghanistan. We did reassign 2 submarines from the exercise, but hopefully it's understood that Safe Syria 2 essentially went ahead as planned. With the end of that exercise in sight, the time has come to decide what force deployments offer the right balance of capabilities to enable us to continue to play a full part in the coalition's military operations. We have rightly made a commitment to our closest ally, the United States, to stand shoulder to shoulder with them, and we are determined to do just that. Our armed forces have already made a major contribution to the coalition against international terrorism. The objectives of the campaign remain as follows. It is to bring Osama bin Laden and the other al-Qaeda leaders to justice. It is to prevent Osama bin Laden and the al-Qaeda network from posing a continuing terrorist threat. And it is to ensure that Afghanistan ceases to harbour and sustain international terrorism. The Secretary of State has previously described the forces we have deployed so far. These are considerable: 3 submarines and some 10 specialised air-to-air refuelling and reconnaissance aircraft. The roles these forces have played, both in attacking targets in Afghanistan and in providing vital support functions to coalition strike aircraft, remain crucial. So too does our decision to allow the US to use our airbase at Diego Garcia. We must now look ahead to how else we can help in defeating international terrorism. Our current forces are primarily configured to assist in the coalition's air campaign. That campaign will continue and develop over time. So must the capabilities we assign to it. We have therefore decided to create a large and rebalanced force in the region. It is a concrete demonstration of our resolve to see the campaign against international terrorism through to the end. We have said we are in this for the long haul, and we mean it. The force has therefore been designed to ensure that we are well placed to deal with a wide range of contingencies and to maintain operational flexibility for as long as necessary. It also allows us to accommodate the inevitable changes in the tempo of our military operations. I'm sure you'll understand that I cannot go into too much detail about how we envisage the new force operating. But as I've said, it will allow us to retain considerable operational flexibility and will greatly widen the scope for future operations. Let me just describe the forces which we will now reassign to Operation Veritas from exercise Safe Syria 2 when that exercise finishes next week. It will comprise of the following: the aircraft carrier HMS Illustrious, which will be re-equipped for helicopter operations, the assault ship HMS Fearless, a submarine able to launch Tomahawk missiles, the destroyer HMS Southampton, the frigate HMS Cornwall, 7 Royal Fleet auxiliaries, the RAFA's Sir Tristram, Sir Percival, Fort Victoria, Fort Rosalie, Bayleaf, Brambleleaf and Diligence. 4 additional support aircraft consisting of Nimrod maritime patrol aircraft and Hercules transport planes. In addition, some 200 of Forte Commando Royal Marines based in Taunton will be aboard HMS Fearless as the lead elements of an immediately available force to help support operations. The remainder of Forte Commando, in the region of 400 men, will return to the United Kingdom, but will be held at a high readiness to return to the theatre should our operational needs make that necessary. This arrangement will also permit us to rotate companies aboard ship and so guarantee the whole commando remains fresh and fully prepared for operations. This powerful force totals some 4,200 personnel in theatre. It represents a major enhancement of the coalition's capabilities. The threat from an enemy as evil and indiscriminate as international terrorism places everyone in danger. There is no question that a response to the events of the 11th of September is necessary. However, we did not take the decision to deploy these forces lightly. No government ever enters into military operations with the attendant risks for our servicemen and women without the most careful thought. In this case, we were particularly conscious that the reinforcements are men and women who have already completed a long and demanding exercise. They have been long separated from their families in this country. I know that places a great strain on both our service personnel and their families. The knowledge that loved ones are deploying on operations can only increase the anxiety, the concern, the strain that the service families affected must feel. We will do whatever we can to ensure that these families have the support that they need at this time. The deployment of our armed forces is a grave step. We do it in the confident knowledge that by doing so we can depend upon them to make a difference. Our armed forces are special and we are deservedly proud of them. We ask a lot from them and they will not let us down. Any questions?
Adam Ingram there, the British Armed Forces Minister, giving journalists in London the latest details on the news that deployment of British troops to help the American forces will get underway. Listening to that briefing at the MOD was the BBC's diplomatic editor, Brian Hanrahan. Brian, is this announcement very much in line with expectations?
Well, it's a little less than perhaps most people had been speculating. I saw the Minister being very firm about speculation, but the speculation that was around earlier the week suggested there'd be rather more than the numbers he's announced today. And I think this is very much a holding statement. If you look carefully at these numbers, the idea of having 200 Royal Marine Commandos is about enough to provide force protection for the SAS. We know the SAS are there in the area, possibly on the ground, running their own missions. What you would want is a backup mission that could go in and rescue them if they got into difficulty in order to watch their back to help them get out. And 200 men is about the right number to provide that kind of support. It's not enough for a major attack into Afghanistan. It's not enough to set up bases, as the Chief of the Defence Staff was suggesting earlier this week, might become necessary. So I think what we're seeing is simply setting up the infrastructure in order to go on further. A lot of this has been concealed by the big military exercise going on in Oman until now. They've been able to have that kind of backup support there if the SS needed it without having to announce it publicly. Now that all those troops are pulling out and going home, they're having to make a formal announcement of what it is they think they need if they are to support operations inside Afghanistan. Note the phrase there that he said these are lead elements of an immediately available force to help support operations, not necessarily those that will go in and carry out operations themselves on the ground. This is the backup force, the rescue force for special forces operating inside Afghanistan.
But Brian, the scope is there, is it not, to expand and extend Britain's role if and when the time is judged right? Everyone, British politicians, talking very much, as we heard there, about being in for the long haul.
Indeed, and it will be a long haul, judging by the way this is being configured now, because they are talking about bringing most of the troops back to Britain and sending them out again in future if needed. What they are keeping in the area is the Naval Task Force, which is considerable. They have both Illustrious, which is an aircraft carrier, which is going to be swept of its aircraft effectively, or swept of its strike aircraft, and instead is going to carry helicopters, which will be able to carry people in and out of Afghanistan. And they have Fearless, the amphibious landing ship, which is a home effectively to the commandos. That could take considerably more than the 200 there. So they are obviously keeping a considerable capability to put a lot of men into that area if they need. And what that means is they must have somewhere bases nearby where they can fly men out and resupply them. So they need land bases in order to get men fed into this seaborne flotilla from which they could launch assaults if necessary.
Brian Hanrahan in London, thanks very much indeed. There'll be more from Washington in just a little while, but now let's cross to Islamabad and Lise Doucet.
Thank you, Jane, and welcome to Islamabad. Well, military action against Afghanistan continues. The latest reports say American warplanes again struck the Afghan capital, Kabul, today on the Muslim Day of Prayer. 2 young girls, sisters, were reportedly killed in a village just outside the city. And American planes continued their airstrikes overnight, again targeting Taliban front lines just north of the capital, and again around positions around the northern city of Mazar-e-Sharif. It's been a key target for opposition forces, but despite heavy fighting in recent weeks, the Taliban defences have not been broken. Jim Fish reports.
There's been no let-up in the bombing of Afghanistan. Raids on Kabul went on through the night into Friday morning. Pictures from the Al Jazeera TV station show apparent damage from the raids to civilian areas of the Afghan capital. With few independent observers on the ground, the facts are hard to establish, but there's been a steady flow of injured civilians across the border into Pakistan. Aid agencies are increasingly dismayed at the rising toll the bombing is exacting on civilians in the firing line. There's also growing concern for the fate of the leading Afghan opposition figure, Abdul Haq, now reported to be in Taliban hands. This former guerrilla leader was trying to rally opposition to the Taliban, having earlier warned of the dangers of bombing the country.
Just by firing few rockets and bombing a few places in Afghanistan, it will not stop any terrorist activity in this country, and it will make people upset and angry, especially if some civilians get hurt and civilians get killed, their houses get destroyed. They will all go support Taliban, although their system is going down. In that way, they will increase the support and some kind of a popularity for Taliban.
But perhaps the most pressing reason for United States and Allied concern is the effect on Pakistan of the influx of wounded or simply desperate people across the border. The Pakistan authorities have tried to keep the refugees close to the border to avoid inflaming local opinion. This is a new camp built by the UN near the Chaman border crossing. But the fear is that for every refugee here, there are many more trying to escape Afghanistan. Jim Fish, BBC News.
Well, the capture of the former Mujahideen commander Abdul Haq represents quite a significant setback for his efforts and the efforts of other Afghans, backed of course by the United States and Pakistan, to break the Taliban hold on southern Afghanistan. Abdul Haq's brother has been giving more details in a press conference in the northwest Pakistani city of Peshawar. Let's go there now to join our correspondent Clive Myrie. Clive, what did Abdul Haq's brother have to say?
Well, his brother Hajiddin Mohammed made it clear that Abdul Haq had crossed into Afghanistan about 5 days ago on October the 21st, that he'd actually gone in not to stir up trouble or to try and open another front against the Taliban, but in fact had gone in on a peace mission, had gone into his local area just south of Kabul, where he's from, to talk to tribesmen, his clan, villagers about the situation on the ground and what the international community was doing as regards the situation on the ground. Now, he made it clear that it was about 10:30 last night that his brother was arrested, was detained by the Taliban. His brother had no arms, apparently. He was arrested with another 7 to 8 men, and that he wasn't in there to cause trouble. He was there on a peace mission, and he appealed to the international community and all Afghan-loving people around the world to put pressure on the Taliban to get his brother released.
Of course, many Afghan exiles have been meeting in Peshawar, where you are, Clive, preparing to go inside, including even representatives of the former Afghan king Zahir Shah. Do you think this will give them pause for thought?
It certainly will if they're thinking of trying to start some kind of military campaign, to try and open up a second Pashtun front to try and tackle the Taliban and join forces perhaps with the Northern Alliance who are moving in from the north. Remember that Abdul Haq is one of the great heroes of the liberation struggle in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union. He carries a lot of moral authority and military expertise. This is a massive blow to the cause of those Pashtuns and those opposition forces outside Afghanistan who were hoping that a second front could be started against the Taliban.
Of course, the Taliban spokesman had reported that Abdul Haq actually called for American air cover, which brought in the helicopters, an effort which didn't work. Is there any suggestion that efforts will be made to try to free him?
Well, his brother today made it clear that as far as he was concerned, there was going to be no armed attempt to go in and get his brother released, that he hoped that peaceful negotiations could take place to try and get the safe return of his brother. It has to be said that he said that his brother had not apparently used the satellite phone that he had with him to try and get American help. The Taliban claimed that the Americans tried to get in there and save him, but they didn't come. But his brother says that wasn't the case. Abdul Haq did not radio or call for the Americans to try and extricate him from the situation he was in.
Clive Myrie, thank you for joining us with the latest from the northwest Pakistani city of Peshawar. So, trouble for opposition forces in southern Afghanistan, and the Taliban are also holding out just north of Kabul, despite several days of intense bombardment of their front line. Commanders with the opposition Northern Alliance have begun to call on the United States to change their tactics and indeed to drop more missiles. Well, our World Affairs editor John Simpson is behind those front lines about 30 miles north of Kabul. Let's join him now. John, first of all, Britain is preparing a contingency force to go into Afghanistan when it's needed. What do you think can it do inside Afghanistan in this war?
Well, I assume more or less what American special forces have started to do, to take part in secret operations behind the lines, to work with different Northern Alliance groups, encouraging them, training them, working out ways in which they can be more effective. I assume that that's what it's going to be. I don't think it's going to be a sort of some sort of mass attack with British soldiers or indeed American soldiers filling the trenches and fighting that way. I think it'll be mostly in a supportive, advisory, and occasionally in a kind of commando sort of function.
And after days of American bombardment, what's the balance of forces where you are?
Well, I've got to say that the Northern Alliance are pretty depressed about the state of affairs. I mean, they're depressed about Abdul Haq, but they're also depressed about the lack of effect of American bombing. I had a meeting this morning with a number of very senior commanders, frontline commanders, and they were all saying how depressed they were about the way that the American help has in fact turned out. They weren't expecting it to be like this. They've been under bombardment, of course, before. I think just about all the men I was meeting had been in the liberation struggle against the Russians, and they thought they knew what it was like to be bombed from the air, and they thought it was terrifying. The Americans, of course, not the slightest bit interested, the Russians not the slightest bit interested in those days who they killed, and their bombing was pretty indiscriminate. And they were expecting the Americans to be somewhat similar. Instead, they find these lancet-like, these surgical strikes, which just simply take out one position and leave all sorts of others standing, and they don't think that's going to be of effect at all.
John Simpson, thank you for joining us from just north of Kabul. There, the mood of growing frustration as the Taliban stand their ground. That's all for now from Elise Doucette. Let's get the latest from Jane Hill in Washington. Jane.
Lise, thank you. Well, here in the US, it's feared now that mail sorting machines could be helping to spread anthrax after traces of the bacteria were found at the Maine clearinghouse in New York. Postal workers across America are now being checked for the disease.
The biological and the psychological threat mounts with every new confirmed case of anthrax poisoning. The latest person to be infected with the bacteria works for the US State Department in Washington. Investigators are now looking at the possibility that ordinary letters which have come into contact with contaminated mail may be able to carry anthrax spores, spreading this dangerous disease. The lethal spores have been found on sorting machines in New York. People are starting to wonder whether all postal workers should be taking antibiotics just in case. At the moment, 10,000 Americans are taking the drug Cipro, which can kill anthrax before its deadly poison has been released into the body.
It is highly concentrated. It is pure. And the spores are smaller. Therefore, they're more dangerous because they can be more easily absorbed in a person's respiratory system.
The American government is spending $175 million on protective gloves and masks for postal workers. 2 workers from the Maine sorting office in Washington, D.C. died earlier this week from inhalation anthrax. They'd been handling mail destined for Capitol Hill. The hunt for those behind the anthrax scares is not proving simple. Today, President Bush announces a new anti-terrorism bill. It'll give American law enforcement agencies extra powers to tap phones, track internet use, investigate money laundering and monitor international border crossings. It's all high-level stuff, but in the meantime, some of Washington's mail is being trucked out of town to Ohio, 4 hours away. There it's being radiated and sorted by hand, a laborious and costly process that's hampering normal life and services across America. Rachel Ellison, BBC News.
Live now to the White House and our correspondent Hilary Anderson. Hilary, the hunt, of course, continues for the perpetrators of these anthrax attacks, but the focus in Washington today very much on this new bill.
That's right, and very significant bill it is. It basically gives the intelligence and investigation agencies here sweeping powers to try to track down terrorists or people that they think are terrorists. This means they've got much wider powers for tracking these people through the internet, through tapping phones, not just phones that belong to the suspects, but also any phone that they might use. And crucially, the authorities are now allowed to detain for up to 7 days without charge anyone they think might be a terrorist. Civil liberties organizations here are highly critical of this, saying that this goes against the fundamental nature of what makes America America. But the government has swept this legislation through in almost a record 6 weeks because of the significance of the current situation.
Hilary Anderson, thanks very much. Well, joining me here in the studio, I'm delighted to say we have Joe Lockhart, the former press secretary to President Clinton. Good to see you. The terrorism bill, it is going to cause controversy, but do you think it's what Americans really want at this time?
Well, I think the Senate and the House are reflecting the will of the public that more needs to be done. I think much of this bill is symbolic. I think politicians often act in a quick way when there's been some crisis or tragedy. But there's some pretty significant pieces, particularly the roving wiretaps, the sharing of information, including grand jury information, which had been walled off before, that'll allow law enforcement new tools. And frankly, this is something law enforcement has been pushing for, and previous administrations have been pushing for, and Congress has been reluctant to do.
What's your take on the balance of information in this war, both the military and the anthrax war? Is the American public bombarded with information? Is it actually frightening them, or is it about right, do you think?
Well, it's very interesting because it's a tale of 2 different stories. On the war, Afghanistan, the bombing, the administration has been quite clear about what they're doing without great details, but I don't think the American public is clamoring for those details and why they're doing it, how they expect to win this. On the other hand, on the threat at home, anthrax, the administration has been missing in action in some respects, because the president and some of his people have tried to stay out of it and leave it to a cabinet secretary and to Tom Ridge, the Homeland Security new director. And I think they've suffered because of that. We've had different voices, and the American public really doesn't know how serious the threat is.
Joe Lockhart, many thanks. That's all for now from Washington. Bye-bye.
You wouldn't smell it, you couldn't see it, you wouldn't know anything had happened.
But how real is the terrorist threat from biological weapons?
It's not difficult for committed and knowledgeable people.
Panorama, Sunday at 10:15 on BBC One.
Savage and wild.
The deep mystery of the forests.
Brutal and wild.
A climate where it is summer every day and winter every night.
Ferocious and wild.
Rare and exotic creatures roam free across the land. Wild.
Wild Africa, one continent, so many worlds, starts 7th of November on BBC Two.
Peter Pascal.
I've been thinking.
And he couldn't talk to me.
I didn't want you going on like a broken record.
He's a smart lad.
I take it you didn't crack him.
No. I went in there starkers. With a gentle touch.
Don't you think I should perhaps do this one, Andy? He might be a bit more forthcoming.
Who plays by the book?
I've been doing as ordered, Andy, checking the archives. Only your name keeps on popping up where it shouldn't.
What makes him a good copper? I do. Very dapper. Where are you going?
Just taking Leslie for a drink.
Hope she's not as cheap as your aftershave.
Take the rough with the smooth.
DL. And Pasco.
The new series starts Monday at 8:30 on BBC One.
Today's lunchtime news special means the doctors can be seen at 2:10, which is their new regular time, right after Neighbours. And you can see this afternoon's Diagnosis Murder with Dick Van Dyke at 2:40. And that's the shape of this Friday afternoon on BBC One.
This is BBC One in London and the South East. Now the news at 1 o'clock with George Alagaya and Mike Ramsden.
Going in, Britain commits ground troops for the next phase of the war. 200 Royal Marine Commandos are available immediately. HMS Illustrious will lead a flotilla. 4,000 more troops will follow. Crisis in the travel industry. Thomas Cook cuts thousands of jobs. The new baby boom, why 1 in 5 mothers now has a caesarean.
And later on BBC London, after the security scares, the Met cracks down on the capital's anthrax hoaxes. And a rescue package for the West End, 100,000 free theatre tickets.
Hello and welcome to the BBC's news at 1 o'clock. 200 elite commandos trained for battle in the harshest of conditions are now on immediate standby for action on the ground in Afghanistan. In all, 4,200 men and women will be involved. The government made the announcement in the Commons this morning. At the same time, the Defence Secretary has been personally briefing commanders in Oman, where many of the troops have been on exercise. The troops available will be available to support the operation in Afghanistan. 200 Royal Marines from 40 Commando are to stay in the Gulf on HMS Fearless after the current exercise ends.